Following Butterfield's sensational revelations to the Irvin Committee, Herbert Kalmbach, who had been President Nixon's personal attorney, took the stand. In response to a question from Senator Weicker, Kalmbach explained why secret methods were used to collect and distribute huge sums of money for the Watergate defendants.
These activities were believed by you to be proper. Why was cash used instead of the normal procedure in handling payments of such amounts?
This was what I was directed to do, Senator.
These activities were believed by you to be proper. Why was it necessary to obtain the services of Anthony Ulasewicz to distribute the monies to the defendants and their attorneys?
Again, this was the procedure that I was directed to follow.
These activities were believed by you to be proper. Why was Mr. Ulasewicz given a code name, Mr. Rivers, and why were Mr. and Mrs. Hunt given the code name of the writer and the writer's wife, and Mr. Haldeman the code name of the brush?
Senator, again, this is just an abundance of caution in the carrying out of the assignment, the confidentiality and the secrecy of the assignment, all of which gave me this ongoing concern.
About a week later, John Ehrlichman, the President's former Assistant for Domestic Affairs, took the stand and vigorously denied all charges against him.
I welcome this opportunity to lay out the facts and publicly set the record straight on a number of questions. Some of these questions have been legitimately raised. Others are created by leaks to the press, falsehoods, and misunderstandings. I'm here to refute every charge of illegal conduct on my part, which has been made during the course of these hearings, including the material leaked to the news media. What I say here will not be new, but it may be different from what you've been reading in the papers.
The committee cross-examined Ehrlichman about numerous aspects of the Ellsberg break-in.
On the first occasion when I did discuss this with the President, which was in March of this year, he expressed essentially the view that I have just stated, that this was an important, a vital national security inquiry, and that he considered it to be well within the constitutional both obligation and function of the presidency.
Ehrlichman's peppery attorney, John J. Wilson, insisted
the CIA must have thought that it had some foreign relationship because they had done an ineffective profile on Ellsberg.
Well, the CIA had no business doing that because the law prohibits them from having anything to do with internal security.
Sir, you wouldn't consider that foreign intelligence activity as a
No, this was a domestic intelligence activity. These people were from the Clemens, from the White House.
Yes, but
we had a man passing secrets to the Soviet government.
Well, Ellsberg's psychiatrist wasn't doing that.
Senator Irvin also clashed with Mr. Ehrlichman.
I think the thing that your argument artfully chooses to avoid dealing with.
I'm not trying to avoid anything. I'm trying to hit this proposition.
Well, now, Mr. Chairman, you've interrupted me.
The Fourth Amendment head on.
You have the delightful trial room practice of interrupting something that you don't want to hear.
The committee's most combative witness stepped down from the stand after 5 days of testimony. In September, he and 3 other former Nixon officials would be indicted for their participation in the Ellsberg break-in. H.R. Haldeman, former chief of staff at the White House, was the next witness to appear. In contrast to Ehrlichman, he was soft-spoken and deferential.
It was very clear to me on March 21st that the President was exploring and probing, that he was surprised, that he was trying to find out what in the world was going on. He didn't understand how this all fit together, and he was trying to find out. He was pushing hard for that kind of information from Mr. Dean. The President further was concerned about how this ought to be dealt with, and he was interested in getting views from Ehrlichman, Dean, Haldeman, and Mitchell, because he felt that those views might be enlightening as to what the true situation was. For that reason, he asked that a meeting be held with the 4 of us in the immediate future, and such a meeting was scheduled the next day.
Most shocking was the admission that Bob Haldeman had heard some of the Watergate tapes.
I wasn't permitted to listen in my capacity as a witness before this committee. I was asked to listen in my capacity or former capacity as a staff assistant to the President and as the assistant to the President who knew of the existence of the tapes.
At the President's request, I recently reviewed the recording of that meeting, at which I was present throughout, in order to report on its contents to the President. I should interject here that I also reviewed the recording of the March 21st meeting of the President, Mr. Dean, and myself for the same purpose, and I have made reports to the President on both of these meetings. I have not at any time listened to any other recordings of the meetings in the President's office or of the President's phone calls.
Haldeman's testimony incensed the committee. Several members expressed resentment that the President would allow a former advisor to take the tapes home, yet refused to let the committee and the special prosecutor hear them. Former FBI Director L. Patrick Gray followed on the stand. With real contrition, he told of reading and burning 2 files John Dean had given him and described as political dynamite.
At the time, I accepted the 2 files from Dean and Ehrlichman. At the time, I destroyed them. And on the several occasions prior to my denial to Henry Peterson on April 16, in which I resisted disclosure of the fact that I had received and destroyed the documents, I believed that I was acting faithfully, loyally, properly, and legally pursuant to instructions given me by top assistants to the President of the United States. I have come to believe, however, what I should have realized then, that my acceptance of the documents in the first place and my keeping them out of the normal FBI files was a grievous misjudgment. My destroying them and resistance of disclosure only compounded the error. That the documents were not in fact Watergate evidence, while legally significant, does not lessen my present belief that I permitted myself to be used to perform a mere political chore. I shall carry the burden of that act with me always.
Gray also informed the committee about a July 1972 conversation with the President.
At 11:28 a.m. on Thursday, July 6, 1972, the President called me. He expressed his congratulations to the FBI and asked that I express his congratulations to the agents in San Francisco who successfully terminated a hijacking there the previous day. I thanked the President and then said to him, and to the very best of my recollection, these are the words: Mr. President, there is something I want to speak to you about. Dick Walters and I feel that people on your staff are trying to mortally wound you by using the CIA and FBI and by confusing the question of CIA interest in or not in people the FBI wishes to interview. I have just talked to Clark McGregor and asked him to speak to you about this. There was a slight pause, and the President said, Pat, you just continue to conduct your aggressive and thorough investigation.
Former Attorney General Richard Kleindienst and Henry Peterson, Chief of the Justice Department's Criminal Division, were the final witnesses during Phase 1 of the Irvin Committee's hearings. Peterson did not implicate the President in any way, but he made no secret of his resentment of the special prosecutor.
I resent the appointment of a special prosecutor. Damn, I think it's a reflection on me and the Department of Justice. We would have broken that case wide open, and we would have done it in the most difficult of circumstances. And do you know what happened? That case was snatched out under us when we had it 90% complete.
Yes.
With a recognition of the Senate of the United States that we can't trust those guys down there. And we would have made that case, and maybe you would have made it different. But I would have made it my way, and Silver would have made it his way, and we would have convicted those people, and we would have immunized them, and we would have gotten a breakthrough. I've been there too long, and this has been a terrible year.
Hardly anyone could disagree. Watergate had ruined many men and severely damaged the nation's confidence in its government. When the committee recessed on August 7th, 7,500 pages of testimony had been recorded. Perhaps somewhere in those contradictory pages lay the true picture of the President's involvement in the break-ins, the heinous campaign tactics, and the cover-ups. At midnight on August 14th, all bombing of Cambodia ended. The United States would continue only unarmed reconnaissance flights and military aid. A day later, the President delivered a long-awaited speech about Watergate. He denied having knowledge about the break-in or cover-up before May 22, 72, and promised to be more vigilant against dirty politics in the future.
No political campaign ever justifies obstructing justice or harassing individuals or compromising those great agencies of government that should and must be above politics. To the extent that these things were done in the 1972 campaign, they were serious abuses, and in the future, my administration will be more vigilant in ensuring that such abuses do not take place, and that officials at every level understand that they are not to take place.
The President concluded that it was time to turn the Watergate matter over to the courts and for the rest of us to get on with the urgent business of our nation. A week later, with his popularity at an all-time low, President Nixon held his first press conference in 5 months. He indicated he would abide by a definitive Supreme Court decision on the tapes, and that he planned to serve out the rest of his term.
Do I consider resigning? The answer is no, I shall not resign. I have 3.5 years to go, or almost 3.5 years, and I'm going to use every day of those 3.5 years trying to get the people of the United States to recognize that whatever mistakes we have made, that in the long run, this administration, by making this world safer for their children, and this administration, by making their lives better at home for themselves and their children, deserves high marks rather than low marks.
The President also expressed confidence in Vice President Spiro Agnew, whose career was threatened by charges from the U.S. Attorney.
The only thing that I can tell you is that the letter related to possible violations of criminal statutes, to the best of my recollection, including bribery, tax fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. That's my recollection of it, and please don't hold me to the total accuracy of it. That's the best I can recall. I am denying them outright, and I'm labeling them as damned lies.
Presidential advisor Henry Kissinger was named Secretary of State in late August. Before his Senate confirmation, a month later, Kissinger promised a bipartisan foreign policy.
I wanted to say that the President has done me a great honor to nominate me for a position that was held by such great Americans as Secretary Stimson, George Marshall, Dean Acheson, John Foster Dulles, all of whom were united in one basic approach, that the foreign policy of the United States is not a partisan matter, that it concerns the whole nation, that the future of our country transcends any particular administration.
On September 5th, President Nixon held his second press conference in 2 weeks. He scored Congress for failing to take action on many of his legislative proposals and indicated that he would be sending them a new State of the Union message concerning programs which needed immediate action. After enumerating his proposals for fighting inflation, preventing an energy crisis, and improving housing and education, the President concluded,
I'm simply suggesting that we have had this year, as far as the Congress is concerned, a disappointing performance so far. I'm not placing individual blame on that. I'm simply saying we have 3 months left. And I know that the Congress is usually a last quarter team. In that last quarter, we have to score a lot of points. The executive, the White House, all the agencies of the government will work with the leaders of the Congress to move forward on these initiatives for the people. But it's time for us to turn to these initiatives that are in the interests of all the people and turn to them on an urgent basis.
The Irvin Committee hearings resumed on September 24th with the testimony of convicted Watergate burglar E. Howard Hunt, Jr. Hunt told the committee that Charles Colson, a former counsel to the President, knew about the large-scale intelligence scheme which led to the Watergate break-in. The committee had hoped to hear Colson's testimony, but he had taken the fifth. Hunt informed the committee that he was crushed by the government's failure to protect him from prosecution.
I want to emphasize that at the time of the Watergate operation, I considered my participation as a duty to my country. I thought it was an unwise operation, but I viewed it as lawful. I hope the court will sustain my view. But whatever that outcome, I deeply regret that I had any part in this affair. I think it was an unfortunate use of executive power, and I am sorry that I did not have the wisdom to withdraw. At the same time, I cannot escape feeling that the country I have served for my entire life, and which directed me to carry out the Watergate entry, is punishing me for doing the very things it trained and directed me to do.
Patrick Buchanan, a speechwriter and political consultant to the president, followed Hunt on the stand. He admitted that he had promoted a strategy to undercut Muskie and to elevate McGovern in the 72 campaign, but he insisted that there were no illegal activities in his proposals. Buchanan also spoke about tricks perpetrated against Mr. Nixon in 1972.
I recall in just briefly, three of his favorites. One of them was in 1962 when Mr. Nixon began to deliver a major address from the back of a railroad train. He put on an engineer's cap and signaled the engineer to drive off, leaving Mr. Nixon standing there. Another was favorite was during a major political speech. Just as the speaker reaches the denouement, he drops the fire escape on him. A third was, we were down at the Hotel Hilton down there in Miami Beach, and there was out front demonstrating there, I thought it was welfare mothers, or we'd heard it was welfare mothers at the time. They were all black, they were all pregnant, and they were all carrying placards that said, "Nixon's the one."
A month after he had been accused of accepting bribes and kickbacks, Vice President Spiro Agnew requested a full and public hearing before the House of Representatives. House Speaker Carl Albert refused.
The Vice President's letter relates to matters before the courts. In view of that fact, I will not take any action on the letter at this time.
I have found myself the recipient of undefined, unclear, unattributed accusations that have surfaced in the largest and the most widely circulated organs of our communications media. I want to say at this point, clearly and unequivocally, I am innocent of the charges against me.
Mr. Agnew intended to fight.
I want to make another thing so clear that it cannot be mistaken in the future. Because of these tactics which have been employed against me, because small and fearful men have been frightened into furnishing evidence against me, they have perjured themselves in many cases, it's my understanding. I will not resign if indicted.
The summer of 1973 was not for boys from yesterday, but a lithe and powerful slugger from Alabama who chased a legend's record. Henry Aaron just missed, swatting his 700th homer and 13 more.
Fans in left field. Huge turnout in the left field seats, bringing nets, hoping to catch a home run. The 1-1. Swanton, there's a drive! Deep left field! This ball is going, and it's gone! 700 for Hank Aaron.
The nation was temporarily diverted from Watergate by an engaging motor mouth who made tennis front-page news. Bobby Riggs wound up silenced by Billie Jean King, who whipped tennis balls against his larynx. King wound up as the female athlete of the year.
September marked the end of 46 years of civilian rule in Chile. President Salvador Allende Gossens was overthrown in a violent military coup. In Argentina, Juan Perón was elected president. His wife Isabel became the first woman in South America to serve as a vice president. On October 10th, much to everyone's surprise, Spiro Agnew pleaded no contest to the charges against him and became the first vice president in the history of the country to resign. 5 days later, Mr. Agnew addressed a shocked American people and explained why he hadn't fought the case.
I did consider that very seriously. But it was the unanimous judgment of my advisors that resignation would carry a presumption of guilt sufficient to prevent a defense on the merits. And I'm afraid that what I've been hearing and seeing and reading persuades me that they were right. God does reign. I thank him for the opportunity of serving you in high office, and I know that he will continue to care for this country in the future as he has done so well in the past. The government at Washington does live. It lives in the pages of our Constitution and in the hearts of our citizens, and there it will always be safe. Thank you, good night, and farewell.
2 days after Mr. Agnew's resignation, President Nixon ended the suspense and announced his choice for vice president.
Our distinguished guests and my fellow Americans, I proudly present to you
the man whose name I will submit to the Congress of the United States for confirmation as the Vice President of the United States, Congressman Gerald Ford of Michigan.
In his acceptance speech, House Minority Leader Gerald Ford indicated his desire to reunify America.
It seems to me that we want in America a united America. I hope I have some assets that might be helpful in working with the Congress and doing what I can throughout our country to make America a united America. And I pledge to you my full efforts, and I pledge the same to my colleagues and to the American people.
Reaction to the Ford nomination was generally favorable. Senator Edward Brooke, who would later become the first key Republican to ask for the president's resignation, said laudatory things about Congressman Ford.
I think the president made a wise choice. He certainly is a man who's not divisive. He's respected by Democrats as well as Republicans.
The Ervin Committee lost its battle to secure the secret presidential tapes when Judge John Sirica ruled that the committee's request did not lie within the court's jurisdiction. 2 days later, President Nixon announced that he would not appeal a court order requiring him to turn over subpoenaed tapes to Special Prosecutor Cox. However, instead of supplying the actual tapes, he would present Mr. Cox with a personally edited summary. In addition, he ordered the special prosecutor to drop demands for other tapes and notes of presidential conversations. A major conflict had begun. In a televised news conference, Cox defied the president by promising continued court action.
The instructions are inconsistent with pledges that were made to the United States Senate and through the Senate to the American people before I was appointed and before Attorney General Richardson's nomination was confirmed. If you go through the hearings, you will find repeated pledges by both of us that I should have complete independence to decide how to conduct these investigations and prosecutions, and particularly complete independence in determining what evidence to seek.
The president reacted sharply, ordering Attorney General Richardson to fire Cox. Richardson resigned rather than comply. Assistant Attorney General Ruckelshaus was fired when he, too, refused to fire Cox. The shakeup at the Justice Department left Solicitor General Robert Bork acting Attorney General. It was he who finally fired Cox. An avalanche of criticism resulted from the president's actions. Senator Daniel Inouye called for the president's resignation, as did the AFL-CIO's executive committee.
We ask him to resign in the interest of preserving our democratic system of government, which requires a relationship of trust and candor between the people and their political leaders. We ask him to resign in the interest of restoring a fully functioning government, which his administration is too deeply in disarray to provide. We ask him to resign in the interest of national security. If Mr. Nixon does not resign, we call upon the House of Representatives forthwith to initiate impeachment proceedings against him.
Bowing to public pressure, President Nixon announced that a new special prosecutor would be appointed. Congress wanted assurance that the new prosecutor could not be abruptly dismissed, as Cox had been. Senator Charles Percy proposed a plan.
The nomination, both nominations, would be subject to confirmation by the United States Senate. The special prosecutor will be given full authority to take up where the Cox investigation laid off, investigating and prosecuting all offenses against the United States arising out of the campaign and election for the presidency in 1972.
At about the same time, President Nixon decided to hand over the controversial tapes to Judge Sirica after all. A week later, another bombshell. White House attorney J. Fred Bazart told Judge Sirica that 2 of the tapes did not exist.
Hunter comes forward 2-2. Ground ball towards short. Campanera digs it out. Throws to first. The game is over. Oakland has won the 1973 American League Championship. Final score, Oakland 3, Baltimore nothing.
The 1973 World Series saw Oakland beat the Mets, but off-field drama rivaled the hits and runs. Mike Andrews of the A's was fired by Oakland owner Charlie Finley for making 2 crucial errors. then reinstated by an embarrassed Commissioner Bowie Kuhn. Oakland manager Dick Williams resigned after the series, hoping to manage the New York Yankees instead. Finley sued to stop him, Williams filed a countersuit, and the bizarre case drifted into 1974.
In early October, as Jews around the world were observing Yom Kippur, their holiest holiday, Egypt and Syria attacked Israel. Michael Comet, Israel's ambassador to England, was outraged.
We would not sacrifice a single soldier to start aggression in the Middle East, and the last day we would choose to do that would be on the holiest Jewish day of the year, which is the Day of Atonement. And I think that the Arab attack on that day, which was incidentally simultaneous to the second from the Syrian side and the Egyptian side, which shows that it was premeditated, it is particularly revolting to everybody because they thought they would take us off guard on a day of prayer and holiness of this kind.
Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan pledged all-out war. Throughout the month, intense fighting raged on two fronts. In the Sinai, Israel waged a major offensive to counter early gains made by Egypt. Group W correspondent Jay Bushinsky witnessed the fighting on the Syrian front.
We just saw the Israeli Air Force and the Syrian Air Force tangle before our eyes over the mosques of the village of Han Arnaba, which has been taken by the Israelis. It was a fantastic sight. There was a sudden burst, a sudden glow, and then black smoke, and cheers by the Israeli Armored Corps here, the fellows who are waiting in the rear and watching all this before they either move forward or move back. And this is Jay Bushinsky in newly occupied Syria on the road to Damascus.
Losses to both sides were heavy, and the United States prepared to supply Israel with arms. This angered Arab states, who retaliated with their most powerful weapon, an oil embargo against the United States. This action severely compounded the energy crisis we were already experiencing. An earlier White House plan for the mandatory allotment of fuel would no longer suffice. Egypt and Israel reached a ceasefire agreement by the end of the month. Much of the credit belongs to Secretary of State Kissinger, who served as a mediator during the negotiations. Peace, however, was short-lived in the Middle East because both sides broke the agreement. Fortunately, Israel accepted a proposal that she attend peace talks with Egypt, Syria, and Jordan in December. The New York Times reported that Charles B.B. Rebozo, the president's closest friend, admitted accepting a $100,000 cash contribution from agents of billionaire Howard Hughes. Robert Mayhew, a former Hughes aide, claimed that the contribution was made in exchange for political favors. Rebozo kept the cash for 3 years and then returned it. President Nixon came to his friend's defense in a late October news conference.
At the conclusion of the campaign, he decided that it would be in the best interest of everybody concerned, rather than to turn the money over then to be used in the 74 campaigns, to return it intact. And I would say that any individual, and particularly a banker, who would have a contribution of $100,000 and not touch it because it was turned back in exactly the form it was received, I think that's a pretty good indication that he is a totally honest man.
This and the concurrent disclosure that President Nixon intervened in an antitrust suit against ITT dealt another staggering blow to national confidence in the president. Mr. Nixon hoped that the appointment of another Watergate prosecutor would alleviate this distrust. He therefore selected Leon Jaworski, a Texas lawyer, for the post, and promised him the independence elucidated by Acting Attorney General Robert Bork.
He has been promised the full cooperation of the executive branch in the pursuit of his investigations. Should he disagree with a decision of the administration with regard to the release of presidential documents, there will be no restrictions placed on his freedom of action.
On November 5th, Mr. Jaworski took the oath of office.
Do you, Leon Jaworski, solemnly swear that you will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that you will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that you take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that you will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which you are about to enter. So help you God.
I do.
Not long afterwards, the Senate Judiciary Committee confirmed the appointment of Senator William Saxby as Attorney General. Watergate hurt the president at the ballot box. In New York City, Democrat Abe Beame won by a landslide.
This has been a tremendous victory for all of us. I'm grateful and at the same time humbled by the mandate the people of the city have given me.
In Detroit, Democrat Coleman Young became the city's first black mayor. Even in traditionally Republican districts, such as Westchester County, New York, the swing to the Democrats was apparent. As a result of the poor showing at the polls, more and more Republicans joined with Senator Brooke in asking for the president's resignation. Consequently, the president discussed Watergate with numerous Republican leaders, including Senator Charles Percy.
But I think we did reach him and get through to him and impress upon him the depth of feeling of the American people. And he has a sincere desire now to close this credibility gap and to restore faith in his integrity.
The president pledged total cooperation in the Watergate probe. This, however, was not enough to turn the tide. And at a mid-November news conference, the president made an unprecedented statement.
I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. People have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
A week later, the president's lawyers told Judge Sirica that there was an 18-minute gap in one of the subpoenaed tapes. The president's secretary, Rosemary Woods, admitted that she accidentally might have erased the 18-minute segment, or at least part of it. In early October, Prime Minister Golda Meir flew to the U.S. to confer with President Nixon.
I'm confident that the friendly relations between our two countries, which manifested themselves so often in the past and lately, that these relationships will be enhanced and grow. The President has assured me that the security and well-being of Israel are a major concern to the United States.
In early November, President Nixon delivered an energy message.
Unfortunately, our expectations for this winter have now been sharply altered by the recent conflict in the Middle East. Because of that war, most of the Middle Eastern oil producers have reduced overall production and cut off their shipments of oil to the United States. By the end of this month, more than 2 million barrels a day of oil we expected to import into the United States will no longer be available. We must therefore face up to a very stark fact. We are heading toward the most acute shortages of energy since World War II. Our supply of petroleum this winter will be at least 10% short of our anticipated demands, and it could fall short by as much as 17%.
John Love, the White House energy advisor, warned Congress that we would face a more serious energy crisis unless the president's legislation was promptly enacted.
With conservation and immediate government action, including legislation, this legislation, and cooperation, and I need to stress that, from every American, the impact may not be too bad, but unless we do have those various parts of the solution, we run some very serious risks with the shortfall of this magnitude. We're talking not only of the potential of cold homes and the lack of gasoline, but a potential of a very serious disruption in our economy.
Senator Henry Jackson felt that the president's energy message didn't go far enough. He urged the president to implement rationing.
Every day that it's delayed, the more we will face the kind of problem that no one wants to face, and that is a catastrophic situation along in February or early March, in which we will have sections of the country that simply will not have gasoline available. There will be areas where there will be a total blackout as far as energy is concerned. Now, that's the challenge that the administration must face.
Treasury Secretary Schultz rejected the idea of rationing.
I think that rationing
end-use rationing is an administrative nightmare, and it tends to lead to black markets. And it's very difficult to do. So I think it should be something we regard as a last resort, not as something you immediately go to.
Evidently, the president agreed, because rationing was not one of the measures he announced. However, the sale of gas on Sunday was prohibited. A speed limit of 50 miles an hour would be enforced, and allocations of heating oil would be reduced. Despite these measures, investors feared that the energy crisis might cause a recession, and the stock market took its greatest plunge in 11 years. Other countries were facing similar shortages. The Netherlands observed gasless Sundays, and Japan resorted to rationing. England faced severe labor cutbacks as a result of the energy shortage.
For the time being, while the problems on the supply of energy last, we shall have to postpone some of the hopes and aims we have set ourselves for expansion and for our standard of living.
Despite the hardships they were enduring, Britishers took time to enjoy the festivities connected with the November wedding of Princess Anne and Mark Phillips, an officer of the Queen's Dragoon.
I, Anne Elizabeth Alice Louise,
I am Elizabeth Alice Louise.
take thee, Mark Antony Peter,
Take thee, Mark Antony Peter,
to my wedded husband,
to my wedded husband,
to have and to hold,
to have and to hold,
from this day forward,
from this day forward,
for better, for worse,
for better, for worse,
for richer, for poorer,
for richer, for poorer,
in sickness and in health,
in sickness and in health,
to love, cherish, and to obey,
to love, cherish, and to obey,
till death us do part.
till death us do part.
Greece was torn by political unrest. 2,000 students who demanded the overthrow of President Papadopoulos were arrested at Athens Polytechnic University. Later in the month, the head of the Greek armed forces disbanded 28 student organizations in the hope of averting further violent dissent. This measure was not successful because President Papadopoulos was ousted on October 26th. Lieutenant General Phaidon Gizikis succeeded him.
The feelings that I have for America and especially for New York, where I have lived so many years, where I have played so many times with all the great artists that have been here every year, with Paderewski, with Isaïe, with Intradis, with so many others. All have been so good to me, too good, naturally, too good, because they have said things of me that I don't merit.
That was virtuoso cellist Pablo Casals, who died in November at the age of 92. Other autumn deaths include heart specialist Paul Dudley White, Zen philosopher Alan Watts, Nobel laureate Pablo Neruda, and jazz drummer Gene Krupa. On a happier note, Old Blue Eyes is back. Singer Frank Sinatra returned to television on November 20th with a well-received special. Earlier in the year, he had put aside retirement to entertain at the White House.
This House is honored to have a man whose parents were born in Italy, who from humble beginnings went to the very top entertainment, Frank Sinatra.
You make me feel so young. You make me feel that spring has sprung.
It's quite a boot to me. It's difficult to even put it in words, except that I'm honored and I'm privileged to be here.
While Israel was mourning the death of former Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, her troops were exchanging fire with Syria on the Golan Heights. Despite Israel's refusal to withdraw to the October 22nd ceasefire lines, Egypt decided to attend the Mideast Peace Conference scheduled for December 18th in Geneva. Secretary of State Kissinger left for the Mideast and Europe to smooth relations with our allies and to encourage serious peace negotiations. While in Paris, Secretary Kissinger met with Le Docteur to discuss the deteriorating situation in Vietnam. At the beginning of December, President Nixon named Deputy Secretary of the Treasury William Simon to head a newly established Federal Energy Administration.
Energy policy now calls for action, and we will do whatever is needed to put this country on the road to self-sufficiency.
John Love, the White House Energy Czar, resigned as a result of the Simon appointment.
The 1973 football season was distinguished by O.J. Simpson. The Buffalo Star demolished the pro rushing record, gaining 2,003 yards. He did it with style, brilliant open field cuts, and blinding speed, which deserted him only occasionally.
Backs in a split, Chandler wide right, double tight end Buffalo. Second down, 4 yards to go at the Patriots' 6-yard line. The handoff to Simpson, swinging to the right, driving it in, touchdown! O.J. Simpson.
He was Sportsman of the Year in 1973, and Simpson joined with Aaron, Secretariat, UCLA, the Knicks, Riggs, King, Nicholas, Ryan, and many more who gave their best to help a nation escape unpleasant realities. It was almost good enough.
Senator Jacob Javits commented on the Ford confirmation.
I also wish to state that when, as is now fully expected, Representative Ford is confirmed by the House tomorrow to be Vice President, there will exist a new situation concerning any call on the President to resign in the interests of the country. It was a very clear point to me when this issue was first raised that it could not even be considered in the absence of a Vice President chosen pursuant to the 25th Amendment. By tomorrow, that should have been accomplished, and thus consideration of resignation or any call for resignation will properly come to the front, and in such a context, I and others will have to give every thoughtful consideration to that possibility.
House Majority Leader Gerald Ford became Vice President on December 6th, the first in history to be selected by a president and confirmed by Congress.
I'm deeply grateful to you, Mr. President, for the trust and the confidence your nomination implied. As I have throughout my public service under 6 administrations, I will try to set a high example of respect for the crushing and lonely burdens which the nation lays upon the President of the United States. Mr. President, you have my support and my loyalty.
The House Judiciary Committee was considering impeachment. John Doerr, Assistant Attorney General during the Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson administrations, was named special counsel to the committee. In other Watergate matters, the Ervin Committee won statutory authority to seek help from the federal courts in obtaining President Nixon's recordings. Later in the month, Judge Sirica ruled that 2 of the tapes be returned to the White House on the grounds that they had nothing to do with Watergate. In December, Special Prosecutor Jaworski received the first of the disputed Watergate tapes.
The judge has just made his statement, and the statement points out that a reel of tape has been turned over to us. It relates to 2 conversations, and no executive privilege had been claimed as to these. Judges verified them, and we received a copy of them.
The Senate passed Social Security legislation, which eased the burden on low-income families, and legislation which extended the national debt ceiling. The House voted overwhelmingly in favor of denying lower tariffs or export credit to the USSR unless the President could certify that the Russians would not restrict the emigration of Jews to Israel. Congressman Charles Vanek voiced the majority opinion.
In effect, it says that the American people are not willing to trade unless the trading partner, the country that desires this trade, complies at least with the Human Rights Declaration of the United Nations.
The House also approved $2.2 billion in emergency military assistance to Israel. The Senate Appropriations Committee voted for a 50% reduction of military aid to South Vietnam and Laos. In December, there was much talk about the comet Kohoutek, which later proved to be elusive to the millions of people who tried to get a glimpse. 1973 was not a very good year. Here is Rod McLeish to give his perspective.
The eternal riddle of history, it's the one constant in human preoccupations, is the question of whether time is spent within the dictates of some pattern beyond our comprehension, or whether everything is random and, therefore, pointless. The late 20th century, an era so in love with facts that it dismisses speculations on mystery as superstitious rubbish, would hold that time and events are random and accidental, and of provable cause and demonstrable effect. Therefore, bad years like 1973 are viewed as the result of such pragmatic factors as bad management, bad politics, bad foresight. That 1973 was bad, few people would argue. The bright political promise of Mr. Nixon's second term was soiled by the myriad revelations lumped under the heading Watergate, and probably soiled beyond redemption. An ugly war in the Middle East was made even uglier by its inconclusive ending, and the consequences it indirectly created to bedevil the northern industrial world. The energy crisis, a new term made instantly shop-worn by its very repetition, came as the profoundest shock of modern times, because it postulated a limitation on the firing engines and grinding wheels that are the central thematic chords of modern industrial life. With the revelation of energy shortages, the very assumptions of late Western civilization quivered on their foundations. While government TV spots urged Americans to save fuel, commercials on the same medium urged customers to buy more of the old fancies of an age gone slightly eccentric in its profligacy. Electric carving knives, cars with engines powerful enough to yank up tree stumps, even a gadget for electronically cleaning false teeth. As if to symbolize the profundity of the dawning new condition begun by 1973, a man from the transitional American past died. Lyndon Johnson had left office just before Mr. Nixon, scorched by fires of controversy, ridiculed for his Texas accent, and despised for his role in Vietnam. But like President Truman, who died in late 1972, Mr. Johnson's popularity was not shriveled by suspected malpractice in office. Rather, Truman and Johnson were disliked at the ends of their presidential terms because of policies that were unpopular. When President Johnson passed on, there was a faint note of regret that flickered in a nation still bruised by the Southeast Asian adventure he had put it through, a sense that that complex and lachrymose titan was a man killed by the disappointments of an age that neither he nor his severest critics could understand. What was most important about 1973 was that it was a year of new beginnings, most of which promised tormented results in 1974. If scandal gathered upon Mr. Nixon, its traumatic outcome was likely to be experienced in the new year, as a battered, anxious nation went through either an impeachment proceeding or the first presidential resignation in history. The inconclusive nature of the Fourth Arab-Israeli War held at least the incipient promise of yet another trial by arms in an area of the world that has never managed to find any other way of relieving its unendurable tensions. The Geneva Conference was the one alternate hope. The energy crisis, while full of the promise that a profligate Western civilization would learn to be more sensible about its consuming habits, that crisis also promised jarring adjustments, quarreling over reduced resources, and even armed conflict. The possibilities of another Suez, a European-Israeli joint assault on the oil-producing states of the Persian Gulf, was remote, but not out of the question. Was all of that the result of bad management, bad politics, and bad foresight? If so, the badnesses occurred in remarkable coincidence. Or was all of the unhappiness of 1973 and all of the warning which permeated its events dictated by some pattern we cannot understand? The question continues, and it doubtless always will. This is Rod McLeish.